and help me. Thank you for patience and hanging in there. So today I'm going to be talking about something I've gotten really, really into lately, and I'll explain lots of why I've gotten passionate and intrigued by this topic. But I'm Elena. I'm a professor at Minnesota State University Mankato. This is my 8th year as a counselor educator. I've been at a couple different institutions, but it's my tenure year. I feel really pumped about it. So can't wait to get that signed and sealed so I can start being a rebel rouser around my area because we need more people to shake our system up. Okay, so we're talking about intersections of adult cultural identity development and cultural capacity. And the adults that I'm primarily focused in this conceptual piece would be college age, but it extends also into supervisors that we work with in the field, clinicians that I've worked with in different training and education capacities, and certainly counselor educators ourselves. I'm going to talk about that intersectionality. There's a lot of intersectionality within these constructs, so very excited to present what I've been getting into this last year. I have not presented live in front of people in about 2 years now. It feels a little uncomfortable, I'm not gonna lie, but I'll get with my groove pretty soon. So my goal is for today to talk to you about the intersections of adult identity development and what that means for this phrase I've been using for the last 2 years, cultural capacity. We hear cultural competency a lot, and I've put my own spin on it, good morning, for cultural capacity, and I'll talk about why I did that. I want to give you some specific tactics and techniques that I'll use. You're all counselor educators here. Counselor. Student. Okay. Yes. Okay. So one day you'll be in a position to utilize hopefully the stuff that I give you today. And then time bearing, because we did get started a little late, I have an activity that reflects the work that I have my students do, that I have my supervisors in the field do, to get closer to what I've come to an identified goal of cultural capacity. So that's my goal today. I might have been a little ambitious with how much stuff I can put in here. But I wanted to get started with a quick little activity to broach into what we'll be talking about today. So think about, what do you remember learning about culture, race, ethnicity, diversity, and of the above for elementary age? And then think about what was happening in the world, specifically regarding race relations when you were an adolescent. How do you think that has shaped your mindset and your worldview about topics like diversity? Feel free to talk aloud, feel free to keep it to yourself. I'll start with my own example. When I was in elementary, I was born and raised in Southern California. And this was in the 90s. Well, I was born in the 80s, but I was in Southern California in elementary school in the 90s, and this was during the Rodney King era. So I remember hearing about it, but as a child, not really understanding much of what was going on. So as an adolescent, while I was elected when I was in high school, that was very prolific, as well as 9/11 happening. I was a freshman, so we had some very big iconic events happening. And I'm going to hold my thoughts for number 3 so that I don't give away the rest of what my presentation is about. So what do you remember? What's going on in your elementary school? And it's okay to say, I don't really remember, because I just don't remember. I was thinking. Yes. Yeah, and that in a human development sense, that makes a lot of sense. These are very big, deep things. I can't think of a better word for it. Deep things, right? And to be able to process and understand it as an early childhood. I've not met an early childhood person like that. I'm sure there's something out there that can, but that would be out of the threshold of normalcy, I think. What else? Do you guys remember anything?
Very similar to 9/11, or just some trauma.
Great. About as an adolescent, high school, adolescence, we've kind of extended that time, that age frame a little bit. And while I work with individuals we call adults, because I do teach undergrads, I have a different of that encountering the lifespan as well too. So early college, anything stand out to you that
I was an adolescent in the 70s. So when I was a senior in high school, the AIDS epidemic was really starting. I was preparing to go to college, and I remember Paris Match magazine in my French class. And the acronym in French is SIDA. And so that culturally is what I remember most. And that really did shape then my college experience. Things really got shifted from just a couple of years over. That's the thing that
Anything coming to mind?
Well, I was trying to think about number one, and like I remember doing a book report about like Harriet Tubman or learning about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but I don't think really I learned about culture,
Yes.
race, and ethnicity.
Yeah,
I think
hold on
that's
to that
kind of the
thought.
way we talked about it where I was.
Yes.
In Virginia is where I was.
And that's gonna become kind of this emerging theme of what I'm talking about today is what we're learning, how what we're learning shapes what we do. So like I said, I grew up in Southern California and very diverse, lots of racial diversity and ethnicity in the areas that I grew up in. And my very first memory, I think I was in first grade in my school system specifically, was we were having a Cinco de Mayo event or something related to Mexican heritage, quesadillas and dancers. And that's what I remember. And so we had different cultural events that we would participate in throughout the year. But I don't remember ever talking about either three of these. And I didn't have a school counselor, which is very common, unfortunately, in elementary schools. So I get into my adolescence and I come from a military background. My father's in Vietnam vet. Both my grandparents are World War II vets, and I grew up impoverished. Both of my parents are addicts. So I sat in the back where the free lunch area was, which ironically I was thinking about this morning, was also where the trash cans were, not where the paid for lunch was. It was light, it was bright, it was in the front, sat back. But we never talked about race relations, right? And then as I got into high school and college, and I started to attend school that was more predominantly white, we had a lot of racial tension between our African American and our Mexican American groups. They started busing the kids in from the inner city, and the system wasn't prepared to talk about race relations. And so we had this back alley in between portables, which if you're not from the West Coast, we have portables for classrooms. We run out of space in the building, portable. I live in the Midwest, that would obviously never apply because it's too damn cold. But I'll never forget this, we have this alleyway that separates the buildings and the portables, and there would of students on either side, almost like gangs of New York style, come in and fight, and the system never talked about it. We didn't have debriefing, and I teach my school counselor, talk to your kids about what's going on, let them talk about what's going on. So then I find myself in grad school, and I first started in Capella University taking online classes because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do counseling. I had started in my undergrad with government science, thought I was going to be here, and then after about 3 years realized I didn't care much about politics or law. I just switched to sociology and anthropology, perfect fit for me. And I started working in a Head Start facility, moms and early childhood educators, so natural childhood education, working with a lot of diversity. I'm running after school tutoring programs as a part of my my work study grant in the same middle school that I went to, and so I share a lot of stories just to preface, because that's how I kind of process it. And I'm working in the same middle school that I went to, and we're delivering this after school program, and there's mainly the kids who came were a makeup of different racial diversities. There's these two boys, and they're talking about this young girl who's I can resonate with, kind of spazzy, kind of on the edges, and they're telling me, I hate saying this, it's sexual activity that they were engaging in, and I'm sitting there like, I'm not really sure what to do with this information that has just been vicariously given to me. Never talk about any of this stuff in school. So now, okay, I'm taking this multicultural counseling class with Capella, and most of the students came ironically from Minnesota, because Capella is a Minnesota, Minneapolis-based institution. And I remember being really taken aback by the surface level of the conversation and mindsets and perceptions that were coming out in discussion. And and just, interactive discussions I'm having. These individuals, and I know this for a fact, we've been with us for 7 years, have been exposed to racial diversity. They were not having conversations about race and ethnicity. Their knowledge primarily came from a book or an article, and they were being asked to respond to some higher level order of thinking of things related to advocacy and social justice. And now here's the main point of this story. So I took my first in-person class at the University of Redlands, where I graduated from my both my undergraduate and graduate. And as I was transferring in, they would not count my multicultural counseling class with Capella because we didn't talk about pluralism, which at the time I'm just like, what's going on? And, okay. No, I was raised very military. You don't talk about it. Just kind of like, just tell me what I need to take them. So I get into this class, and pluralism, our focus was on leadership and advocacy. We didn't talk about definitions of race and ethnicity. We didn't talk about, we were talking about yesterday, boxes, the different boxes of racial groups. We talked about, so what are you going to do? Now there's some assumptions in that I'll talk about in the next slide. But those two very different experiences, it was like I was foreshadowing this presentation for many years. I kept talking about it in class and saying, we didn't start with chapter 1 of the textbook. We started with a whole different book altogether that said, what are you going to do about the problems that we see? It was assumed in your role, you understood that you were going to take on as a leader. So I'm going to preface that as I continue to go on, and I'll come back to that story once. Because I had a lot of inspirations for this topic. What I continue to encounter a lot is disconnection with students I work with and their cultural backgrounds. There's either a conscious disconnection or an unconscious disconnection that we all have culture. Culture doesn't belong to just one population. We are all owners of our own cultural backgrounds. And that lack of awareness of disconnection for our cultural frameworks, it influences our behaviors and our actions. Lack of awareness is not a good thing. We want to be culturally responsive. We have a lot of socio-political influences that on our mindsets about culture, race, and ethnicity, and we're sometimes conscious and we're sometimes unconscious of it. And I feel like this has probably always been a theme and a thread, and with the resurgence of social media, we have much more access and knowledge and awareness of what is going on. Either good or bad, depending on your own mindsets, but it does influence. I keep continuing across this thing too, a shame and guilt as a norm among Caucasian students. And we talk about how I address that on some further slides. So, so here I am, and I don't want to say asked because I'm not asked when I want to teach. Usually I'm told to teach. It's two different ways of thinking of that. And what I found commonly is that individuals of color are tokenized to teach the multicultural counseling course. This is assumed because you're a person of color, it's supposedly better than anything else. And I'll talk about that also later. So I've been teaching this class now at 3 different institutions. And I started with a traditional approach, and I was not seeing what I thought I wanted to see with reflective mindfulness, authentic engagement, using basic practices, and ultimately culturally responsiveness. And so I'm teaching this class, and I kept going back to that same story that I just shared of how we talked about advocacy and social justice. It was assumed all the performative stuff was already taken care of somewhere along in the lifespan, and that you were ready to rise to the occasion for advocacy and social justice. But we've really been missing this dialogue about the evolution of education's influence. That's why I started with, what do you remember in your K-12 education experience? Because it is a part of our human development, thusly our development with our cultural competency and our capacity. But we haven't, I think, given enough conversation to what has been going on. So I meet these kiddos, as I continue to call them, because I have a school counseling background. I meet these kiddos in their graduate program, sometimes an undergraduate, and I think I was pretty naive when I started about where they would be at intellectually, developmentally for these dialogues that I wanted to engage them in. And then I realized I didn't actually know what they had gone through secondary. I didn't know what they had been exposed to what experiences that they were having, what conversations they were having. What I did know though, is that we do a lot of outdated training education practices that we know have no advocacy, but they're still being delivered. And I'm thinking of our conversation yesterday, when you check the clearinghouse for syllabi, you kept finding the same kind of template over and over. But we know diversity trainings don't work. They do not produce the outcomes that we are looking for. And we know that when we teach from a box kind of mentality, fester the separation, we fester the angst that comes from the separation. It does not bring unity, it does not bring inclusion. And we continue to do it. So I've come across these in my last 8 years as an educator, and I got really frustrated with it. I got fed up with it and decided I was going to do something more radical, because I was definitely seeing the influence of human lived experience and early childhood adolescent development, as well as adult development, for what it was doing for our individuals, our pre-service counselors' ability to be culturally responsive, to be social justice advocates. I also came across a lot of assumptions, and within myself as well too. That knowledge would equal action. That if we give them all of competencies and all of the content that they're going to be able to be social justice advocates, that they be responsive. And it was a false assumption. All the knowledge in the world does not mean that you are emotionally ready for what will endeavor on in a cultural exchange, in an advocacy action. The commonly used terms are all defined the same. I started at MSU and I joined our intercultural competency development committee. So I'm very passionate about this topic. We have these definitions that are supposed to guide everyone in the college, which I think is an important tool, that we are grounded by the same mindsets and kind of perceptions on the terms that we use for prejudice, bias, racism, race and ethnicity. And we're reviewing the content, we're evaluating it, we're making some changes. And race is defined as your skin color. So it says the very first one, race versus skin color, which I had a really hard time staring at, because I'm like, well, I'm multiracial, so you just marginalize my entire identity. Thank you very much. And depending on the time of the year right now, sometimes they, oh, you're Hispanic, or oh, you're from Latin America. I'm neither. Actually, I'm Native American and I'm Sicilian dominantly, but I have a lot of other ethnicities in it too. So I'm like, so you've marginalized us. Depending on the time of the season, that will change your stereotype of my ethnicity. And I struggle to believe that that was any further progressive than struggling the last 40, 50 years. If you're telling me it's my skin color, we're perpetuating the mindset of stereotype. And that was a difficult conversation to have with Nadine because she guides this committee, but I'm like, I just can't keep my mouth shut on that one. So other assumptions that we've made: knowledge equals depth of understanding, awareness, and moment. To know something from the textbook does not mean that you can actualize within the moment, hold to it, and execute something that might look like cultural responsibility. As I'm teaching this class for the first time at MSU, I've got a very diverse, emotionally and developmentally group of dominant females, really good females in our counseling track. And I'm talking a spectrum of a young gal who doesn't know what affirmative action is, to somebody who coined phrased herself as, I'm in chapter 8. So if you use the Culturally Alert Counseling book, chapter 8 would be something on the progressive end as a social justice advocate. I'm not in chapter 1, so she was saying, I'm in chapter 8. And then somebody who kind of worked might be in chapter 1. Legitimately didn't, and that's kind of striking to set the group, and someone has the courage to say, I don't know what affirmative action is. It's like, okay, you're about to graduate school counselor. Let's catch you up to speed a little bit. And there was empathy, and there was also angst in the group of individuals, specifically from our chapter 8 person, who was culturally diverse, identified diverse with sexual identity as well. And the peculiar thing to me was, you're calling yourself chapter 8, and now you're met with somebody who is very diverse from you because of their at a different phase of life with their knowledge, and you're struggling to work with them, struggling to find we're definitely categorizing them into some negative boxes. I'm not convinced that's chapter 8. That's what we're calling chapter 8. I'm not convinced that that's allyship or that that is what we want to see with cultural responsibility. Because culture is multidimensional, right? It's not just your skin color, it's not just your race and ethnicity. And so for as much knowledge as I'm sure my student had, absolutely, it didn't mean that she was pulling from it in the moment to find common ground and compassion for somebody who's in a very different space than her. Another assumption that I know I've made is that allyship is constant. And I've encountered this in working in counselor education, where you can see allyship in one place, usually in a non-threatening situation, and then when it's time to be called to task, a lot of silence, there's a lot of withdrawing. And that's been hard for me personally, being in a marginalized position, being on the front end of bias and prejudice practices and wanting allyship, knowing that these are people who put stickers on their cars and on their doors and say, I'm an advocate. And it's like, where's your voice, honey? Where are we at? No, we're not there yet. Because remember, knowledge doesn't equal depth of understanding. In the moment. Another assumption that I think we've come across is that privilege is linear, possessed by a demographic. The more work I've done with many diverse populations across the United States, I've come to understand privilege as more dimensional, and I'll talk about that in a different slide. And then I'll kind of blend these last two to catch up with time. We've assumed that our students come in, that our colleagues that we work with have a strong awareness of family values and what that means for their cultural mindsets. And then at the same time, I haven't found that we are embracing white as a cultural identity. And I feel a little uncomfortable when I say that, because I don't feel like it's the status quo to say white is a cultural identity, but I will talk about why I firmly believe white is a cultural identity. And if we continue to negate that, have this large body of people who are wandering around in our profession out a sense of self-awareness, how their culture is influencing their mindsets, their actions, and their behaviors, and that's a big recipe for disaster, because lack of self-awareness is not going to help you to be a reflective educator, to be a reflective counselor, and it's through our reflective practices that we are able to make culturally responsive choices. So I wanted to build a lot of backfill as I get into talk about this human development side and what it is for our cultural responsibility later in life. And I think because of some of these assumptions that are made, like I said, I'll take ownership of mine too. Because of these assumptions that we've made, it has impacted, it has influenced. I try not to use defining value terms like negative, but it definitely influences the way that we are preparing these young people to be culturally responsive counselors, to be, if you're with doctoral students, culturally responsive educators. We assume sometimes that along this progression, where we meet them, where they become, and what we hope they become one day as educators, that they've acquired all they needed to know and how to do it. They're going to be culturally responsive. I've made this assumption that they're going to know how to teach this content. I used to serve on our faculty association when I was at the University of Wisconsin. And there was this big push because most of our state schools around the region have what we call a purple course or a diversity course. So there was this big push to teach the teacher, basically. And another thing I've learned is older tenure faculty don't know what to do. They don't want what to do unless they want to do it. So there was a lot of pushback on, I don't need to learn how to teach diversity courses. This is an insult to, this is a person from geography saying this is an insult to people who come from these educational disciplines, telling them to learn more. And I just get into that sometimes. And so I spoke up, non-tenured is my first year on faculty association. I was just like, look, I come from this background that you were talking about, and I don't find it offensive because there's no plateau for learning. Each year we learn something. Each year we're exposed to something different, and it challenges what we know, and it gives us something new to know. And I said to the whole body, I said, what you teach comes from in here, and how you decide to teach it comes from up here. And so we will all benefit from thinking about the way that we think of these things and teaching them. Because there's, I think, this fatal assumption that once you pass through here, you've acquired what you need to be able to teach it. I think if that was the case, you wouldn't have found 50 syllabi that look exactly the same, right? This I think we all know, but I just wanted to highlight it as to need to build. I use the metaphor of a cake very often because I like the visual of layers and building a big foundational layer. And so we're kind of in the middle of the cake right now, if you will. But this is needs to be more, I think, prevalent in the courses that we teach, because we have students who come in who don't see culture as multidimensional. And so remember that the colleagues that you have, the older counselor educators, I don't like using that word, but our seasoned counselor educators may not have had this reflective in their training either. So we have to, I think we do need to keep advocating for the dimensions of culture. And my two new favorite ones are these right here. I wouldn't say this is found in the text, but I'm absolutely going to put it up there because this is where I'm focusing on today. And having lived in different parts of the US, so I've lived all through the Southwest, I've lived now in the West, I lived international in Japan when I was a child. The cultural influence of your geographic location is significant. So yesterday in your presentation, about emerging female identities as they're coming to college. One that I've constantly run into, but I would have never seen on the West Coast, is pregnant students. People getting married right when they start grad school, and even those in undergrad getting married and having babies during their school, which is beautiful. I love it. It's just not the West Coast mentality. It's wait till you're 55, but you don't something in life. So depending on just true story. Depending on where you come from, yes.
I'll say something interesting too about geographic location when it comes to, teaching your multicultural class. I thought it was so interesting when I was in my master's program. I had a classmate who was from New York, and he was very convinced that people in New York were not racist. Like they were down in Virginia. And I was like, my family's from New Jersey. I was like, so I've been there a lot, and that is not true. But it is interesting how it'll even, like, you think a certain way about like these topics, and you think because of where you're from, maybe it's like better or worse, when really, again, like, can we categorize it that way? And I don't know. I think it kind of disillusioned him a bit about that.
Yes, thank you for sharing. That's a really, really good example. Oh, I could just go into 10 different stories, but I'll keep going. Thank you for sharing. And I'm jazzed that this is becoming more part of the conversations about culture too. So we're aware of the multidimensionality. I think that's a word. Sure. So now let's talk about the intersectionality of it. We've built up our foundation of our cake. And I thought about what are the influences and the forces in our human lifespan development that are shaping our mindsets on race, ethnicity, diversity, social justice, advocacy. So we have all of these dimensions of culture. And then the four larger systems that I thought were most influential: education, absolutely. How inclusive has teaching been on racial diversity? Janelle and I worked on the AMCD and ADA task force that looked at the intersectionality of human lifespan development and multicultural competency. And what we found in our deep investigations of Google was that it really wasn't clear when we actually started talking about these topics. Maybe, post-Civil War, there were some conversations, some reference to post-World War II, but we really didn't see like a clear statement on when this started until about the 90s. Which is crazy if you think about the amount of older counselor educators that we are working with. These conversations are definitely not what we are having today. I think that's kind of an obvious statement, but we really need to hone in on this because we run into a lot of issues, right, in our classrooms, in our training programs, in our supervision practices. And I firmly believe that this is a big influence on that, is the evolution of this conversation, right? It's clear in the last couple of decades. That is post many of our educators have gone through their training programs. So our awareness of our own cultural family worldview and traditions. So predominant influence in my upbringing is Native American. Do share a lot of stories, not to be stereotypical, but if I was going to screw up, my dad was going to share a story with me. My mother, who was not Native American, was no one as. So two very different influences coming from different cultural backgrounds. But one salient one for me has always been my perception of mothering. And we have a tribal mentality. This has gotten me into trouble in Minnesota because I don't have family there. Like, who raises my baby? I raise my baby. I don't pay for childcare unless it's like a daycare or something, right? So I'm like, I'm gonna bring my child to work because I'm not breaking the policy. And that was not a shared viewpoint. Was there awareness on the other party's ends that it was coming from their own worldview and traditions? I would say no, I don't know that either. Our community systems. What are our culturally rooted customs? What are our, what is the system doing to be inclusive? What are some of our historical references? So that was kind of how we started, is what do you remember? What was iconic and prolific in your development? And then our larger world systems, our political movements, absolutely, our historical movements. George Floyd, that's an hour and 15 minutes from where I currently live. And it's tragic and it's devastating. To be honest, I wasn't surprised because I live in that. I've been racially profiled more than once because my skin was looking dark time during the year for things like buying diapers and having to show receipts to prove that I actually paid for it. I've been racially profiled buying a home. The person, our broker, lied to interview. Our potential broker lied about my ethnicities, that I was Hispanic, and that he gathered that information from the phone. And I don't really read the fine print, I'll be honest. My husband looked at it and was like, why does it say you're Hispanic? And I was like, this is like I'm Hispanic. And we were cheated out of a couple different programs for first-time home buyers. So like, I know where I live, and this is tragic, but this is my community. Why? Why am I encountering this? Never in my whole life have I ever encountered so much prejudice and bias interactions. Why? I'll go back to right here, because I know our school systems. Many of them are graduates now, but the counselors prior to them, this was not on the radar of K-12 education. And I'd say we're doing a better job now in our graduate programs, but back then, when your classes are taught by, don't take offense to this, Caucasian males predominantly, what did I say? It comes from in here. So you're going to get what you get from coming in there. Culturally rooted systems. There's a lot of cultural roots from Norwegian, Germanic cultural backgrounds that are influencing behaviors and attitudes in our students, specifically that there's expectation for submission to authority, especially if you are female to male. Father knows best kind of mentality. I've encountered that in my work too, where I'll give them the benefit of the doubt if they were good suggestions, and I'm like, that's just not really what I want to do, and I have been aggressive for it. What's going on politically? The lack of conversations here, the lack of work done here, these big political movements, and our kiddos just don't know how to process them or what to do with them. And like I said, separation and keeping them in distinct boxes creates more angst than it does understanding. We have this life cycle that we are all going through, whether we choose to or not, because we all encounter this. We all go through our school systems, and we want it to end up here, but there's a missing link. So I'm going to run out of time to talk about what I think we can do to bridge the gap. We meet each other at an intersectional point. How do we bridge that gap? Because we are, I would say we're struggling. I don't think we're failing. I think we've got some work to be done. I like this racial identity development model. There's quite a few that you can pick from. And while this is specifically for African American identity, I found that it was multiple to different types, or from different, race and ethnic backgrounds. And since I have dominantly white students, but every now and then a few culturally diverse students, I wanted to use one that I thought I could use with all, because I think that conformity, dissonance, persistence, emergent introspection integrative awareness ultimately where I want my individuals to end up with something that we could all find common ground with. Because another assumption I think we make is that once we're here, we're always here. And that's not true because there's things that happen in life that cause us to fall off balance, that cause us to question our beliefs and our values. And know as adults that our values and our belief systems transform over time. The way I felt as a knucklehead 21-year-old is not how I feel as a disabled, refined 33-year-old. Because I'm mature, as we've grown up. Your political views at 16, do you still feel the same way you do now in older adulthood? Your values about relationships and friendships, do you still feel the same way? I would argue that most of us have transformed over time, and that's okay. That's a part of the human experience. So integrative awareness is not assumed to always be a constant either. There's, and within mindfulness theory and framework, there are things that cause us to kind of regress back to needing to figure out, how do I feel this way? What is causing me to feel this way? How do I get to an integrative awareness? And maybe I'm here for a long time in introspection. I use a lot of mindfulness activities and practices in my classrooms for that reason, because I think that fluctuate on our spectrum of integrated and we're all in this parallel process together. So what I liked about this graphic is think about in biology, did the T-squares and how interaction with one and interaction with another can find intersectionality with each other. So you see here, student, supervisor, professor, student, educator, colleagues. We interact with each other throughout our lifespan, throughout our educational development. We're always intersecting with each other at a human interactive base. And depending on where you are at in here and where you're at in here, it's going to mitigate that intersectionality, right? It's going to mitigate your supervisory practices. It's going to mitigate your educational experiences, whether you realize it or not. And what I thinking through my thoughts last night, what I find most fascinating about this that I think we've reflected in our conversations that I'm coming to more awareness now is back here. Julie. So Julie, let's say, I'll put myself under the bus. Let's say you're here about a topic that, or an area that you've been really engaged in, have a background with it, you have strong self-awareness, and I'm over here. Or maybe I'm all the way back here. And I'm trying to guide you. I'm trying to mentor you and supervise you. And you're at a different place altogether than I am use LGBTQAI issues, because that wasn't something I coming from Southern California. It's not like you don't interact with many an individual from that sexual identity background. But I find myself stumbling over my own words because we didn't talk about safe spaces. We didn't talk about allied programs, none of that stuff. So I've had to catch up, not that I'm marginalizing or biased against it, but just say you've been a person and you are with clients and you need supervision. And I don't even realize that I'm just somewhere here because I'm just not there yet. So I find that really fascinating. I hear from students all the time their experiences with their educator, with their supervisors. We had a situation with one of our intern students, and he was in a parochial setting for his high school placement. Strong ally, wanted to be known to be an ally for the simple fact that he wanted students to visibly know you're a person that can come to your safe place. That's hard in a parochial setting, right? That's not what is embraced or espoused. And his supervisor said some very marginalizing, just downright ignorant things to his face over wearing a headband. He's got fluffy curly hair, he's from Boston, spunky personality, just wanted to wear a headband, honestly, doesn't want to wear a headband. She interpreted that as, you want the gay kids, she said, gay kids to know that you're there supporting. I've never been so enraged as a supervisor before. It's just like, you're a graduate of our program prior to my time. And you're supervising students who need to build competency and capacity for social justice advocacy. This is what students explore. So but we're in this parallel process. Because I'll give her the benefit of the doubt, she's still developing. While my student is developing, these kinds of experiences are incredibly damaging for self-advocacy. But I just wanted to highlight this, that we are at different continuums, at different points of this continuum. And we find each other at different points in the process. So sometimes we're at these different crossroads, and we said we're all on a journey towards integrated awareness. And so our own self-awareness of what's been driving us becomes that critical intersecting agent. Your puzzle piece is self-awareness. So to meet each other in the middle is to bring awareness to where we're at and to understand how that place is also influencing us. And inevitably, like I said, we're going to be at different destination points because there is no, I've reached it, I'm always there, I'm always going to be there. That's not real life. You can mostly be there and you can try to always be there, but inevitably something is going to come across in your lifespan, in your adult development, that is going to make it fluctuate. And maybe it'll be easier to continue to get back to reflective awareness, but let's not assume that we're always there, and that's okay, that's real life. I'm totally running out of time. Okay, so we use the word competency a lot. The ability to do something successful or efficient. Skills and knowledges that enable us to have good performance in a particular role. Remember what we've been talking about now in this foundational sense of our education experiences, both K through 12 and post-secondary, our lived experiences, our political influences, Bowen's family system, Big Ben Bowen's family system, that multi-generational transmission process, that which we either consciously or unconsciously digest and soak from our family. Talk about family trauma, genetic as well too. And what I don't like about the word competency is, like I said before, knowledge doesn't equal action. Knowledge is power, but it doesn't translate into action. Have different capacities. So cultural capital, that's your accumulation of knowledge, behaviors, and skills that you can tap into to demonstrate cultural competency. If we're talking reflectiveness, your reflectiveness comes from your ability to tap into things that you know, or to have the courage to say, I don't know about this and I need help to understand. Having the capacity means that you'll be able to make decisions about things that affect your daily life. So you need one for the other, but if we stop here, like I said earlier, you can give them all the knowledge, you can lead them to the water, it's not going to always equal capacity. So how do we build capacity? There's some things that we need to accept first. I've said that more than enough times. Remember that skills can be abilities, but they cannot unilaterally translate into every situation because each cultural exchange needs to be viewed unique as its own. If we say that they are all the same, we're absolutely marginalizing that each individual brings, even from within the same racial identity. And so if we say this is a skill for all and every, we're not actually setting them up to be able to transfer skills into different exchanges. Some individuals will remain at their destination point. They might not be at their reflective point, and they might never get there because they truly believe that they are doing the right thing. I've worked with some counselor educators who believe that the right thing to do was to give a colored girl a job, and that was all that they needed to do. And anything after that was, I just needed to submit and say yes, sir. And they believe that they're right thing. Advocacy is absolutely terrifying for some, and some are never going to do it because it is too hard for them to speak up and speak out. And while I don't like that, because there are counselors in training, what other choice do I have except to take some acceptance and continue to try to help them? I'm not done, I'm sorry. We started 10 minutes late in my defense. Privilege.
I'm in here next, it's okay. I'm presenting next to here, so it's okay.
Privilege is dimensional. My students come into multicultural counseling, we talk about identity, and they say, I'm a white female with privilege, and I say, what does that mean? Can't answer my question. They can't define their own privilege. And I do believe that privilege is more dimensional than just your skin color, because I'll give you a very quick example. My best friend, she's a white female, she can't make hyperflexing. It's talking about opium. I grew up on MREs, military rations. I know how to make a lot of things from scratch because I was also homeless when I was 18. Learned how to boil ketchup so that I could have tomato soup. Survive. You remember that classical assessment? Could you survive? And it has all these different scenarios. Knowledge can be privileged too. Shit hits the fan. I'm gonna make oatmeal, and Monica's gonna have all the money in the world. She's not gonna have oatmeal to survive. We know that SES is one of the biggest moderators of privilege, that individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds who have had high incomes, while they have faced adversity, they have found more ability to blend in with their community and to find community sense because they fit into a higher SES category. You can have racial and ethnic privilege. I am a product of affirmative action, and I also get to pull the EEO card if somebody is being stupid to me because I'm a protected class in Minnesota. I've never had to do it, and I don't want to do it, but I have that privilege that others will not. When many a female is going to be marginalized, is going to be discriminated against simply because they are a female. I'll get to pull a card because I'm a Native American female. So I want privilege to be seen as a little more dimensional, and I know that's kind of a radical concept, but I do really believe that privilege has more dimension than just one skin color. Just breeze through. We got to start focusing on getting it right. Because we neglect humanity, we neglect the poor conditions. We're going to stand on that divided and broken bridge and make distant. And I know I'm sorry, kind of really want to finish my presentation. So let's stop focusing on getting it right and let's just focus on thinking. Here's what I found, and this is my own metaphor. Many times I was standing alone in the fire, and then others would come when it was time to help clean ashes. If we're too focused on getting it right, we're going to inhibit ourselves from taking action because we're afraid to get it wrong, rather than focusing on taking that risk, taking that leap, and doing it for the sake of doing the right thing. You can do something that is for the right without focusing on making it right every time. Because the more we keep coming back to just clean the ashes, those of us who have stood alone in the fire, it's damaging, right? We were talking briefly with ourselves about this trauma that is continuing to happen. And when the George Floyd tragedy was, I'm losing my words, George Floyd tragedy. Saw a lot of posts from a lot of former students. I stand with you. I stand with you. This is what inspired this. And I said, don't stand with me if you're not going to speak up. I don't need you to stand next to me. I've standing alone for a long time in my life. If you're not going to take action, if you're not going to speak up, you are just enabling those who are causing injustice because you're not holding them accountable. And this stuff is messy and this stuff is scary. But if you're not ready, okay, don't stand next to me until you're ready to burn. Burn together. And then if there's enough of us, there's not enough fire to burn us anymore. So we don't have time to answer these questions, but I want you to continue to think about how you will help others bridge knowledge into action, how you will help them grow in their confidence, social justice and advocacy, because we do need competency. We need to know customs and traditions. I had never worked with Somali individuals prior to the Midwest, and so I didn't know about handshakes and I didn't know about spatial proximity, and I do need to know these things. I need to know their interpersonal relationship norms. I need to know their customs and their mindsets about the different dimensions of diversity, grief, loss, marriage, childbearing. We do need to know these things. And then we also need to build skills. We need core dimensions of it. Need self-awareness. We need the ability to admit our own limits, bravery for help, to stand in the fire, and conscientiousness for how our actions are impacting others based on cultural. So I did assessments. We did a lot of experiential work. We learned skills.
Is this going to be on? Sorry, is this going to be on the
Yeah,
site too? Okay, because I liked how you were
Okay,
saying
I
what
like-
you did in there.
I got 3 minutes. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, wrong way. Yeah. So I decided I was going to scrap it and I was going to start over because I was frustrated with what I was seeing. And part of a big rationale for including white as a cultural identity was I kept running into students who were ashamed of their identities, felt a lot of guilt, and I found that perplexing because, like, well, if you're actively doing bias prejudice work, you should shame that. But if you're not, born white, what can you do about that? There's a difference in recognizing the sins of our fathers versus taking responsibility for the sins of the fathers. Take responsibility for correcting. Take responsibility for creating and hold them accountable. You need to absorb the shame and guilt. Have a humanistic counseling perspective, and I don't believe that we grow from shame and guilt. I think that shame and guilt for our actions that we have ourselves intentionally done can be a part of growth. Taking shame and guilt for something we haven't done, I don't find that conducive for growth, and I didn't want that to be the foundation of the conversations we had for our experiential work and for assertiveness and so there was a lot of big things that happened. I started doing this work. So I ditched the box approach. I focused on real events that were happening that I knew were influencing our cultural capacity. And I use a metaphor of the coin. We can find ourselves on either side of the coin. And our goal is usually to find middle ground. If you think of a coin, it's very wide, teeny tiny in the middle. And that's what makes mindfulness and reflection hard. But when our goals are self-awareness, our own identity development and mindfulness, it's how we get to the middle side of the coin. Because like I said, you can integrate it. I can other side of it. Still gotta find ourselves together, find your supervisor, right? That's what we're gonna do. So we use our core conditions, we use our mindfulness skills. I'll read these two reflections and then I will end before you get that. Okay, so student A, I've completed diversity awareness curriculums. I promise I'll be done in 2 minutes in the past, but those offered no or superficial interactions with individuals who held marginalized identities. As such, much of the growth that occurred during those programs was self-driven, and I could only learn so much about myself in a passive learning environment. This format of the course forced me to interact with others on a deeper level and create the connections and opportunities needed for true change. Reflecting on the experience, it was uncomfortable. We had some people in tears and we had people freak out and leave the classroom. This is not pretty all the time, but and there were times I was not sure I wanted to come back, but I do not think we would have achieved the same learning outcomes if it was done any other way. So you go down messy road.
No, I don't think that's our door. I think that's from above us.
So you have people who come in, I feel fairly culturally competent, and I got regular checks to that feeling. And these are good things. These were good reflections. So I guess I won't do the activity, but what I want you to walk away thinking about is, what does this my main conversation yourself about that I'm thinking about do for the work that you're going to go back to do as an educator? You'll be a supervisor, you don't have to. They love to make students classes. So you're going to supervise, you're going to educate. We hopefully have a good emerging sense of how our human development trajectory is influencing our cultural capacity trajectory and the need for self-awareness. So this is an activity that I have with you. Pick 4 words that describe yourself using nouns. Those who have a more integrated self-awareness of their cultural background have an easier time picking nouns. Those who don't tend to pick adjectives like I am smart, I am creative, I am funny. And so we have them pick one that is, I know, John, most significant, and define it in relation to their identity. Into groups, and I say, now find what is different about you. And what's really interesting is they always find what's the same. But that's a big part of why we have them have those conversations. And then to think about how it has been shaped, how it influences where you're at in your identity development. That's an activity I have with students too. So I hope this made sense. It's the first time I've fully articulated it on a bigger platform, and thank you very much for rolling with it.